Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar looking at policy, payments and planning and thinking about what it means from a farming perspective. My name is Phil Bicknell and I'm the Director of Market Intelligence at AHDB. So we're the team that do an awful lot of the work that looks at what's happening at the farm level in relation to prices and markets, right through to what's happening at the retail and the food service end, at the consumer end of things. We also do quite a lot looking at what the policy implications are. So whether that's trade policy, particularly the nature of our new trading relationship with the EU, but also increasingly around the farm policy angle and helping to understand some of the implications that are coming down the track for farmers here in the UK. I think it's probably an understatement to say that we live in uncertain times. From a policy angle, that trade deal with Europe certainly gives a bit more certainty, gives a bit more clarity. However, I'm conscious that from a domestic farm policy angle, there's still quite a lot of questions and quite a lot of issues that need to be resolved. We're going to probe into some of those areas for the next hour or so. We're going to hear from Defra and hear a bit about their agricultural transition plan. I'm really pleased that Stephen Ayres from Defra's Programme Policy and Strategy team is going to be sharing the headlines with us. I should say that Stephen's going to be with us for about the first 30 minutes or so of the webinar, so please get your questions in nice and early as we go along. We're then going to throw it open to a panel session. And I'm delighted that we're going to get the thoughts of Neil Wilson, who's Director of SAB Advisory, of Ian Burrow, who's Head of Agriculture and Energy at Natwest RBS, and also from Andrew Wilson, who's a potatoes and cereals farmer from North Yorkshire. But before we do that and get into and hear from Stephen, just a couple of housekeeping points. So look, all attendees will be muted through the webinar. We're due to finish at 2 p.m. and we'll stick to that timeline. The webinar is going to be recorded and we'll publish it on the YouTube channel and on the AHDB website. So if you want to revisit any of the content or pick up any of the points that are discussed, you'll be able to access that within the next 24 hours. So it gives us a bit of time to get it online. You will be prompted to answer a survey and some questions at the end of the webinar. We really appreciate the feedback that you give on this. We're conscious we've got 325 people signed up for today's webinar, so really looking forward to some feedback, and that lets us make sure that we're improving the series of webinars that we run here at AHDB. As I said, feel free to ask questions throughout. You can do this by opening the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. And there's an area there where you can type in any questions. So to say, please keep those coming throughout and we'll pose those to our speakers as we go through the session. Also, if you're having any technical difficulties, then please flag those through that question channel as well. So look, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Stephen. Stephen's from Defra's Programme Policy and Strategy team, as I said. So Stephen, over to you. I'm conscious that I suppose the ag transition plan that we got some detail on from last year, we stretched to what, 64, 65 pages long. So I think you're going to pull out the key points for us in the next hour or so, next half hour or so, and we'll take some questions. So Stephen, over to you.
Great, many thanks, Phil. Pleasure to be here with everybody. I'm going to try to run through this presentation as quickly as I can to allow the maximum time for questions. There will be, as Phil mentioned, quite a lot of text, so I'm going to kind of pull out the key points and leave as much time to have a follow-up discussion, and please get those questions in. I'm really looking forward to answering those as best I can. Any questions that come in that I cannot answer, either because I run out of time or I don't have all the detail to hand, I will come back with an answer after the event. So here's a quick summary of what we're going to run over. It's no secret to say that environmentally sustainable farming is at the heart of what we're trying to do and is at the heart of the agricultural transition plan, and so we will spend a bit of time on that. But I also want to look at some of the practical matters around direct payments and also some of the support that we're going to be offering to help people bridge the gap to our future policy. Next slide, please. I want to really start by focusing on the point at the bottom here. It's an evolution Thank you. An evolution, not a revolution. Now, I recognise that there will probably be lots of questions about timings, for example, or when Defra is going to publish more information. And we recognise that it took a little while for the transition plan itself to be published. We've said that all along that we want to co-design, which is a slightly formal way of saying we want to work with industry to make sure that we design future policy and not have policy be something that is dictated to industry, because that hasn't worked in the past. Obviously, one consequence of that is that sometimes the changes can take a little bit longer to work through. There might be less certainty at the start of the process than people would like, but we're committed to working with everybody to make sure that these changes work. And I'll talk a little bit at the end of the presentation about some of the ways that you can keep in touch with what we are doing and how you can get involved with the process of co-design. Next slide, please. And just to build on that, these are some of our guiding principles that were set out in the Agricultural Transition Plan. I'm going to call it the ATP now for short. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start off by talking a bit about direct payments. One of the big practical changes that people wanted to know about and to have confirmed through the ATP was what's going to happen to your direct payments. It's perhaps not a huge surprise to reiterate, or that the ATP reiterated, that we were going to take the maximum proposed cut from direct payments. That's a maximum cut that was set out in 2018. And we think that this will really help us to kickstart the transition and get these direct payments reinvested into the sector and reinvested into schemes that will deliver positive change for us and positive change for farmers in the industry. So just to confirm that the payments will be cut in a graduated way, a gradual way in the first year. So every single farmer who gets a payment of up to 30,000, that 30,000 or less will be cut by 5%. Every payment between 30,000 and 50,000, the amount starting from £30,000 will be cut by 10%, and so forth. So everybody, even the farmers in the highest income bands, will still have a cut of slightly less than 25% overall, and 80% of farmers will have a cut of 5% or less. We also projected forward the cuts for the subsequent years up to 2024. You may well know that the reason why we can't give any more certainty on financial policy beyond 2024 is that the Conservative government committed in the 2019 manifesto to protect the same cash total for the industry up till 2024, the end of this parliament. So beyond that, it's hard to project for sure for example, what funding total there will be in the industry. That's something that will be decided through the usual political process. But up to 2024, we can say these will be the projected cuts to direct payments. As you can see, they are significant. There will be approximately half of the direct payments overall cut by 2024. We're really keen that all of that money get reinvested into schemes, and it will get reinvested into schemes which help us improve the environmental and productivity outcomes of farming, which I will talk a bit more about in a minute. Next slide, please. Another thing we did in the ATP was to set out what we would call the buckets of spending, and you can see very clearly from this that the proportion of direct payments approximately halves over the 4 years in question, and most of that will go back into schemes which are aimed at improving our environmental and animal health and welfare outcomes. But you can also see the middle bucket is dedicated to schemes which are improving farm prosperity, such as the Farming Investment Fund and the Research and Development, Innovation and Slurry programs, which I'll talk about in a bit. And you can see that that stays constant at about 1/10 of spending. Next slide, please. Just covering a couple of practical issues. It's been very clear throughout consultations and engagement with farmers that there are big and justified concerns about the way that common agricultural policy rules have been applied. And so just because we're phasing those out, we do not want to leave them in amber. We want to improve them and keep improving them right up until the minute that they stop applying. And so there are a few simplifications that we have introduced for 2021, some of which have been announced before and some of which were detailed in the ATP. And some of those are set out below. There's further detail on those and all of these in the ATP, which is accessible online just by Googling Agricultural Transition Plan. Next slide, please. And further to this, talking of direct payments, we do continue to plan for de-linked payments in 2024, and we are still looking to offer a one-off lump sum payment. Both of these are subject to consultation and subject to co-design, but that's something we'll be pressing ahead with, and really looking forward to hearing what people have to say and what people would like to be done in that space. Next slide, please. It's really important as well to emphasise that countryside stewardship is still a viable and a long-term source of income, and along with joining the sustainable farming incentive, which I'll talk about in a minute, if you are eligible for that, either renewing your countryside stewardship agreement if you have one, or taking out a new agreement is a really good way to both derive a source of income which is viable and stable, and also to prepare for the future. We're going to improve agreements, going to make them more flexible, less burdensome, and we're also going to ensure that anyone who gets a place in an ELM agreement can break that countryside stewardship agreement without any penalty. Conversely, if you have a countryside stewardship agreement and you want to keep it, you can't be and you won't be forced to join ELM. A big part of what we want to do is make farming policy a lot more flexible and a lot less prescriptive. Next slide, please. And just to note that there are several woodland creation incentives which will remain available during the early stages of the transition. Next slide, please. Speaking of woodland schemes, there is a tree held scheme pilot which is going to launch in 2021, and then the full scheme will be rolled out in 2024. There's a little more detail on that in the ATP, but the slide there gives you a kind of overview of what we're looking to do through that. Next slide, please. So you may have noticed that there's a slightly different way of speaking about environmental land management, which is and remains the cornerstone of our future schemes. We now are talking about the components of environmental land management. So there are three essentially separate schemes which function together to make up the whole environmental land management offer. And I just want to talk a little bit about each of those. The sustainable farming incentive, which I'm sure we'll have lots of questions on, that is aimed at the farm level, at simple actions that everyone or almost everyone can do, and that if done in large enough numbers will achieve really good environmental outcomes. We then move on to the local nature recovery, which is more aimed at local priorities. It will involve a lot of collaboration, almost by definition, to address those local priorities. And then finally, the landscape recovery, which is the component that really focuses on those projects that will make a difference at a landscape scale. So things like reforestation and peatland restoration that will really help make a significant contribution to particular goals which are set out in the 25-year environment plan and the net zero emissions goals, although of course all of those components will play a part in that. We'll talk a little bit more about the rollout of the Sustainable Farming Incentive, or SFI, as I will refer to it in a minute. Next slide, please. So we heard a lot from industry over the last couple of years that there was a feeling of there not being enough of a bridge from 2021 to 2024, and we agreed. We thought it was a very fair point to make. So the fact that direct payments are being cut starting in 2021, we agreed that there needed to be a scheme or part of a scheme that provided something of a bridge to the future. So elements of the sustainable farming incentive will be available from 2022 to anyone who's currently in receipt of basic payments. We'll also be trialling out and expanding the reach of our national pilot in 2021 for environmental land management, and we're aim to reach about 5,500 farmers through that pilot before the entire scheme comes on stream and is available in 2024. We really hope that the SFI gives people a way to either build on the excellent work that they're doing in protecting the environment, or to adapt to a new way of agri-environmental farming, and such that we really drive uptake of these schemes and start delivering those environmental goals that we need to deliver. Next slide, please. So moving on to talk briefly about the transition support that's available. There are a variety of different schemes available, and we recognise that it could be a little bit complex to navigate, so I just want to pick out some of the main ones. The Farming Investment Fund is going to function broadly in a similar way to the countryside productivity schemes that run at the moment, and the team is currently reviewing the list of items available for that. and we'll be publishing a series of blogs on the Defra Future Farming blog, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. And those will provide a bit more information on things like timings and eligibility. We're currently looking at how we're going to evaluate that scheme and what kind of definitions or measures of productivity that we use. And as with everything, everything in this future farming layout is being co-designed with people as we speak. So it's a really good thing to do to follow the Defra Future Farming blog to get as much of an insight as you can into what we're doing. We're really trying to kind of be out in the open here. We then have the resilience funding, and that is targeted specifically at farmers who are most vulnerable to the removal of direct payments. And there have been pilot projects ongoing for the last couple of years on this, really trying to help farmers to make the right decision for them and their business to adapt to the new way of being in the industry, or in some cases, if they wish to exit, to work out how to do that in a way that's right for them. The ATP also talked about a new initiative for farmers in protected landscapes, national parks and areas of outstanding national beauty. And this is a scheme which we anticipate will be particularly relevant to farmers in uplands areas, many of which, I think about 3/4 of which are within protected landscapes. And this will provide funding to improve things like access, signage, and general provision for public access in the protected landscapes. And then finally, we have the animal health and welfare pathway. So whether you consider animal health and welfare schemes as part of the environmental support or the productivity support offer, it's kind of between both of those. But clearly some of the animal health measures that we will fund will have an impact on the environment because healthier animals produce fewer emissions. But also we know that animal welfare is a worthy goal in itself, and one that the British public, or the English public, I should say, are very concerned about and very willing to pay more for higher welfare goods, essentially, according to surveys. So it's something that we really, really want to support, and it's an important goal of this government. Next slide, please. I also wanted to briefly outline the changes to regulation and enforcement. I think this is a complex issue and one which is going to take a while. The transition is a 7-year transition. We've made it such that it gives enough time to adjust to the new system while not losing the momentum of the changes that we're making. One of the really big changes is a better regulatory system. I think the ATP in general really emphasised that we want this to be a supportive system in the first instance. Clearly, we will need to retain the ability to act when there are major breaches, but we want to make greater use of more proportionate penalties. We want to have more risk-based targeting. We also want to support people back into compliance through warning letters rather than defaulting to penalties in the first instance. And some of those changes will start to roll out straight away, and they will be seen as changes to cross-compliance, but we will also be engaging on how we design that regulatory system in the future. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, there are a ton of opportunities to get involved, and we really, really want to design everything out in the open here. We've heard time and time again that two of the biggest problems are, or have been, the bureaucracy of how things have been designed and the inflexibility, somebody turning up and telling you how to do things and not understanding the full context, and the way in which changes are often dictated to industry and not designed with industry. And we're really looking at other examples of programs both in and outside of government that have worked well in terms of co-design. And so some of the things that we have on offer, we have stakeholder workshops and a dedicated stakeholder engagement team to bring people into those, and we're always looking to get to reach out to as wide a range of people as we can. We have pilots to get involved with. I mentioned some information about the ELM and tree health pilots there. We also have the full Farming Investment Fund launching in autumn 2021, new countryside stewardship offers launching in early this year, and more information coming out about farming in protected landscapes and the ELM pilot as early as we can this year. We also have Defra e-alerts, which we will publish on social media, including our blog and through farming organisations. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've tried to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I appreciate that ideally we'd have a bit more time to run through some of the key features of the presentation, but I really wanted to make sure that we leave time for questions. And so thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and welcome any questions that attendees have.
Thank you, Stephen. I think there's quite a few questions that have come in, so I will we'll run through those in the next few minutes before you have to disappear. Just the one kind of question for a point of clarity. What are the cuts based on? I'm assuming that it's based on the 2020 BPS payment level, and those reductions will be based from that.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I think the final, sorry, excuse me. I think the final exact calculations are yet to be made, but we have a good estimate of what they will be.
Okay. So just a quick plug for an AHDB tool. We've got a business impact calculator that people can access through our website. So assuming that your farm business stays the same, you can put in what your latest claim was, and that will give you an idea about what those payment reductions will start to mean to you. As a question that I was interested in, that's again around the finances. You mentioned about the kind of 3 different environmental land management components. Is there any idea about what the funding split is between those at this stage, and also kind of how that might start to change over time?
I think the answer to that is not yet, unfortunately, and it's very much kind of other pieces what I said about the need to co-design. I think that it's going to take a little while to set the priorities, and I think that will depend on a number of things, and one of those is the overall governmental priorities. So clearly, if we're looking at environmental goals, within that you've got the net zero goal, which is something which is very prominent, will be even more so, particularly with us hosting COP26 this year. You've also got the 25-year environment plan goals, which is going to be dictated to some extent by the progress of the Environment Bill, which will have a big influence on those goals. And so if we tried to set a budget now without knowing exactly what the goals were that we were targeting, and therefore, as a part of that, without knowing which components will best contribute to which goals, I think that would probably be putting the cart before the horse a bit there. I think we also want to, having set out a basic bucketing of how much we're going to spend, which you can work out from the percentages. I can't tell you the figure off the top of my head, but you could work out a percentage spend for agri-environment schemes in 2021. Excuse me. There's then got to be a role for consultation and co-design with industry on what we think are the most appropriate things to target within that. So I hope that not every question is answered by not yet, but that will be one where there's a bit of a way to go before we allocate budget. And I think in answer to the second part of that, yes, there's definitely a chance that budgets will change over time. I think it would be wrong if we said this is a fixed budget. I think we will keep it under continual review. And there's a couple of legal obligations we've taken on in the Agriculture Act to publish reports on spending. And it would be foolish of us not to keep budgets under review, and if we need to change them to do
that. So what you mentioned about, you've used the phrase kind of co-design a couple of times. So I guess one thing that I've really noticed is that some of the kind of blogs and communication from Defra is quite open, but can you kind of give us an idea about kind of what that means in practice? And I suppose from a farmer angle, I'm always concerned that you're just talking to a handful of businesses and maybe people who aren't representative of the wider industry. So yeah, a little flavour about what that means in practice would be really helpful.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that's definitely keeping us on our toes. So we have a dedicated co-design team who unfortunately aren't here today, but I'm sure they would be happy to share a summary of it. I mean, I think we started off by looking at a lot of projects, both within government and without, so kind of social enterprises, some of which were at quite a small level and some of which were at a huge level in terms of the number of people. We then have worked on the kind of principles of co-design. So obviously it's not possible, or it's not plausible at least, to ask every farmer and land manager to input on every change. And if you did that, that would take that's not a goer for any number of reasons, but equally it's a general aim of ours that we want to bring people into the changes as much as possible. So we have what you might call the kind of usual architecture of stakeholder events, particularly around things like the ELM design and then other individual schemes. We also have those things that you mentioned there about trying to be out in the open with our blogging. For example, I know the director of our program is very active on Twitter. And then clearly COVID has put a bit of a spanner in the works, but we try to have if not the actual farm visits for staff. And we try to have virtual farm visits where we have people come and give a tour of their farm, and those are absolutely fantastic events. I think it's a real concern you mentioned, that how you get a representative range of people, and it's great to come to events, events like this, which perhaps don't draw on all the usual faces, but then equally we know that people who come to events like this are probably quite a self-selecting group, and so that's why we've got things like the Resilience Fund to reach out to people who might be a bit less able, or a bit less willing, or not willing, that sounds negative, but a bit less able for various reasons to get involved with co-design of the changes. So yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, as with everything else, we're going to have to keep working and improving it to make sure that we are doing it right. And I really invite people, if you think that, we're not practicing what we preach and we're just kind of saying it for the sake of it, to get in touch with us and raise your concerns, and they always get kind of listened to and passed on.
So I guess the key message is you're open for feedback, and I suppose, I take a bit of heart from the fact that some of the pilots on ELM is going to be around 5,500 farms, I think you mentioned. Question from John Price, which I think is a great one that's come in, and he talks about kind of many of the schemes are likely to require new actions, but to what extent will they reward stuff that is ongoing? So John's example is on the farm, they've got 10 hectares of semi-ancient woodland that is obviously has great carbon sink potential. Is that the sort of thing that's going to get recognised and rewarded?
The schemes are definitely looking at how existing good practice can be recognised and rewarded. Yeah, I think there's a few sort of big questions around that. So clearly there's schemes which are paying for existing good practice, and then you have good practice which is being done kind of for the sake of good practice. And we certainly don't want to have a situation where people are either incentivized to not continue doing something that they're doing which is good, or they feel that they've been doing something good for a while and then somebody else comes along and gets rewarded for doing the same thing. So there's definitely a case for that, and we've said I can't really give much more of a meaningful answer than to say we're looking at how we continue to reward good practice without creating any kind of unintentional consequences. But yeah, it's a really good question, and I think we recognise that while as a whole the emissions, for example, emissions from farming have not declined as much in the last decade as the decade before that, we recognise that there's more than pockets of absolutely outstanding practice. There's a ton of really good stuff that goes on across the farming industry that we want to recognise.
I guess the environmental credentials to the fore, but to what extent, and particularly with from a farming angle, how much of the kind of the aspect of kind of British food production has been kind of factored into some of this, and how we're going to encourage a consumer to buy British, which is likely to be potentially more expensive to produce than stuff that has come in to lower environmental standards.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think there's two kind of aims that we set out in the ATP, one of which was about the environmental outcomes that are sort of foregrounded in that presentation, but we also talked about wanting to have a more productive, more competitive, resilient industry. And we haven't set exact kind of targets or levels on food production, and I think part of the reason for that is that, as many on this call I'm sure will know, there is an independent food strategy review, and it's rightly independent of government, and so we can't kind of and shouldn't seek to kind of second guess what they're going to say. I mean, we have contacts obviously with the reviewers as appropriate, but we're really waiting to see what they recommend, and clearly that's one of the big things that we will have to take into account. I think obviously none of that means that there isn't a kind of an inclination in the programme to support buying British and to support the great, or buying English, at least given that agriculture has devolved, but to support the great work that farmers do. But it's something where I think, as I mentioned earlier, the policies in the programme will have to be updated in response to changing circumstances, and so the food strategy is one of the things that we're really going to look out for with a keen interest before we make any kind of specific commitments on that.
Okay, Stephen, I'm really conscious of time. We've had a load more questions come in. We will take you up on your offer to get answers to those questions, and we'll publish those on the AHDB website. Just one final thing from me is, I suppose, quite a few of the questions relate to the timing. So, what is next? When will people see the next bit of detail, and what will it be about?
Sure. So I think, again, this is one where I'm aware that perhaps we can't go too far beyond what's in the ATP at the moment. I mean, I think when we say early 2021, I recognise that's frustrating for people, but that is where we are. Early this year. So for the ELM pilot, we certainly expect to hear more by the spring. We're looking at inviting expressions of interest early this year, and also providing more on the SFI and local nature recovery components. And the same is true for the countryside stewardship offers our more information on farming and protected landscapes, as that applies to you. And then later on in the year, in autumn, will be the opening for the the opening of the Farming Investment Fund. So it is a little bit, a little bit of a kind of repeat of what's in the ATP, I'm afraid. But this is where I would definitely encourage people to get on the blog and to get signed up to the e-alerts, and we'll spell out as much as we can using those means.
Okay, great, Stephen. Thank you. I know you have to go, so thanks for your time, and yeah, we'll get those questions to you. And thanks in advance for coming back with answers. I'm going to open it up now to our panel. First of all, I'm going to welcome Andrew Wilson. Andrew farms in North Yorkshire, and he's just going to give a bit of a farming perspective. Andrew, I suppose, look, like me, you were probably sat there thinking it probably gives a bit of clarity about the bad news about the disappearance of direct payments, but gives a bit of uncertainty about outstanding areas. What's kind of your take in terms of the Ag Transition Plan? And I suppose, without layering the questions too much, direct payments are a big part of that change that's coming. How are you gearing up for that?
Yeah, I share your views really, Phil. We know what's definite is that we're going to get a reduction in BPS. That's not negotiable. It's there as it is. What's a little bit foggy is where do we go from here in terms of the environmental aspects that we've had on our farm for conservation and stewardship and things like that over many years. Is that going to count for anything in the future? And without more detail of the ALM scheme, that's difficult to be able to focus on. My stewardship scheme's got a few years to run, so I need to worry about it too much in the short term, but it does affect long-term plans. One thing that we've done recently, we've been keeping bed and breakfast pigs for 30 years now. We've spaced to fit another shed in roughly the time BPS takes to expire. That shed should pay for itself on what it can earn, and that will allow us another slice of income that we're not currently getting now, that we've got a little bit of time to build it and pay for it before BPS comes to an end, and it should fill some of that gap. What else are we doing? We're constantly tweaking and evolving, and I've done for many years. That's nothing new. But every enterprise is getting focused on what's it bringing to the table. And sometimes, like my winter beans, for instance, vary quite a lot. We call them a wish crop, because when they're good, you wish you had a lot more of them, and when they're poor, you wish you'd never stolen the blooming things. But consistently, my best weight is after my beans. So on my heavy land, this farm isn't called what it is for no reason. We do grow potatoes, but that's not on the heavy side of the farm. The beans form part of that rotation, and consistently my best wheat on the heavy land is after the beans. I don't get that best wheat without the beans. So providing my average performance is acceptable to good, then they will stay. I keep looking at alternatives to that, but it's got to fit in around the bigger part of the business. There's no point spending a quid to gain 90p, and there's no point removing one element that doesn't seem particularly profitable for something else that has a negative effect on another enterprise. We've got to look at the business as a whole and not make too many knee-jerk changes. It's all got to fit together to work well. The pigs will also, given that they're on straw, they will provide us with some more muck, which helps our soil health and reduces our reliance on fertiliser. Something else that we've done a bit more of in recent years is cover crops. We've quite a lot of cover crops now before any spring crop, be it potatoes on our own land or elsewhere, sugar beets, spring oats, things like that. We've grown cover crops now since 2011, and we keep tweaking and evolving that model to help our soil health in the first instance, but it's also reducing costs, notably in potato cultivations. That's where the biggest gains have been had. But slowly we keep altering how we farm to create capacity to be able to take an opportunity, because I'm a firm believer as to where there is threat, there is opportunity. And where there's opportunity, there's challenge, and one hopes there's some kind of satisfaction or reward at the end of it.
No, that's a great point, isn't it? I think whenever I talk about policy and change, people focus on the negatives and the potential the potential challenges that are coming our way, rather than thinking about the opportunities that it creates. And yeah, particularly when I think about some of the growing demand for food globally, that's a great positive for the industry. When I think about some of the criteria that shoppers increasingly want for their produce, I guess it's another in that positive side. So it's not all one way. Just one question before I kind of introduce another member of the panel. So I know that you're a tenant. I know that on the environmental side, in particular, that really created some challenges with people's ability to get into schemes. So, if you were feeding into Defra, how would you try and make sure that they're developing a system and a scheme that also works for tenants as well as owner occupiers?
Transfer and ceasing an agreement can be quite important in short-term tenancies. I'm very fortunate that I've got a long-term tenancy. So the worry of a 5-year agreement coming to an end, it's only really a worry if I can honestly fall off my perch. My tenancy is long enough to be able to see that through. For somebody that's on a shorter term tenancy, that's much more difficult. And perhaps there's off the top of my head, maybe a need or an opening there for like a tiered approach, in that somebody could have a 3-year deal or a 5, 6, 7-year deal or a 10-year deal, and that there'd be appropriate measures for each one. That for some things take a certain amount of years before you start seeing any real environmental benefits. And if it takes 3 to 4 years to establish it, to start doing some good, and then it comes to an end at 5 years, has it really delivered value? I question that. But if that same measure was there for 10 years, then it could be much more beneficial to all parties concerned, including the environment. There will never be an one-size-fits-all system, whether that be farm scale, farm infrastructure, the area in the country that it's at, or the length of tenure, as you suggest.
Yeah, and I suppose so. The message there is kind of building the flexibility to be appropriate, isn't it? I think for the policymakers. That's
right. I think it's important that the previous track record's taken into account, and that a bit of joined-up thinking is applied. Things like grass margins alongside watercourses. They aren't just providing a bit of grass next to the water. The LERAPS provision is really quite valuable, and that's largely where my grass margins are. We don't need to worry about buffer zones for spraying because the grass margins are wide enough to keep us away from the water. You can't inadvertently get wrong because that grass margin is there to keep you away from it, and that's quite important. Recently, 2 years ago, I think it is, when I started my countryside stewardship agreement, my previous agreement had some field corner grass in there. And one area particularly was really good for wildflowers and clover, and bird life and insect life was really fantastic in it. I was really pleased with it. But it doesn't count for anything in the current stewardship scheme. Without a plough it up and put it into some kind of wild bird food, that area was valueless for the new system. And that was really frustrating because it was so good, I didn't want to plough it up. I didn't want to destroy the good that had been done over a period of time. So for the last couple of seasons, we've just made hay of it, so the low input hay. And the BPS pays the rent essentially. So what the hay provides covers its costs. I can't say it's particularly profitable, but it is maintaining the habitat. And it seems such a shame to knock things like that out because it doesn't tick a box. Yeah, I suppose that's a big risk, isn't it? The kind of perverse outcomes and hence the need for uncertainty. I'm going to move on and introduce Neil Wilson, who's Director with SAB Advisory. So Neil, kind of my question for you, and folks, if you can keep your questions coming in for the panel, that would be great. But I mean, kind of, Neil, what are the challenges that you're seeing coming farmers' way from the policy aspects?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Good afternoon, everyone. Look, I think the word's been mentioned a few times. It's certainly in the near term, is this uncertainty element that's proven a big challenge. You know, certainly when you start looking, I mean, Andrew made a good point there. You know, he's looking at a new shed for B&B pigs. You know, he thinks he can get that repaid before BPS disappears. For lots of businesses looking at long-term investments like that, these are the challenges that are coming along. You know, how can I sit down and work out if this longer-term investment's going to work for me? You know, it might be a potato store, a grain store, a potato store, something like that. Maybe a land purchase. You know, so that uncertainty and the lack of clarity about what there is at the moment. And I know, you know, Stephen talked a lot about that, and there's nothing, doesn't seem to be anything particularly we can do about that at the moment. But there's that uncertainty about, are these schemes going to help me attain some of the lost income or re-attain some of the lost income? I mean, I suppose my view is at the moment it seems unlikely given some of the stuff that Stephen talked about. But then I think over the longer term, when we do get more detail emerging, Phil, then farm businesses I think are going to face a challenge of deciding how to implement these schemes. You know, Andrew talked a little bit about that there. You know, we're looking for flexibility. But then what the consequences might really be for their farm business off the back of this. And actually, since a lot of this stuff was brought up a few years ago, some things that I've had in my mind have certainly been about, are we going to get to a point where farm businesses are going to have to decide whether they want to follow policy that the government give and chase elms and the constituent parts of that for their business? Or are they going to have to start focusing very much on production and the marketing of their product? I'm sure many will be able to do both, but I'm not convinced all will. And I think those are some of the challenges that farm businesses and managers have got in their minds just now. You know, what is all this going to bring to me? What decisions am I going to have to make?
And I suppose the other bit that springs to mind for me, we've at AHDB we've looked at some of the aspects around farm performance, and the numbers are pretty sobering when you look at the gap between the top 25% and then the kind of bottom quartile, and you know, that's typically £100,000 for cereal sector, 50 grand if you're looking at livestock. But yeah, to what scope is there for the businesses that you're working with to do things differently, to kind of move when it comes to farm performance? What's realistic? Yeah,
look, the range across the sectors I think has always been wide, and it does feel as if it gets wider, Phil. Look, I mean, it's an old chestnut, and I suspect some of your viewers will start throwing things at the computer screen in a moment, but there definitely remains scope for farms to tighten costs and in some cases improve their output at the same time. You know, what we're really looking to do here is improve that margin and profitability on farms. Big starting point for me is loads and loads of businesses that I see and have done some work with, they don't actually know how they compare. You know, they've not been doing any benchmarking. So I think one of the good things to start off with is to get some sort of comparable industry benchmarking data. Look, Farm Bench from AHDB would be a good tool to get started on. Then use that info to start focusing on where maybe technical improvements can be made, or costs can be saved. Start setting some KPIs and targets, and start on the efficiency journey. And Stephen talked a little bit about some of the resilience funding, you know, and you start to look at some of the reports coming from there, and actually a bit of efficiency improvement on farm could really take some farm businesses a long way to protect themselves from what might be coming down the road in terms of BPS being shaved. But there's also other things, you know, start looking wider. Andrew talked about being in countryside stewardship. You know, are you in these schemes? Have you actually looked at them? Is there an opportunity for you to go there? And what sort of grant schemes might be out there to help you, you know, make that leap to better productivity? Lots of farms are doing a great job already, Phil, but there are still plenty out there where I think they can tighten up. There's no doubt.
Thanks, Neil. And the check's in the post for the Farm Bench plug, by the way. But you know, I completely agree with that. Yeah, how do you know where you can get to if you don't know where you are now? And you know, having kind of put the family farm through Farm Bench, that's kind of something that's really helped me. I'm going to move on to Ian Burrow. So Ian, look, from your perspective, the bank's a big supporter of British agriculture. I know you've got lots of dedicated specialists. Policy change effectively means less revenue into the farming sector. What's your take, and what's the bank's take on farming and its longer term prospects?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Phil. I wouldn't lose heart. It's just the opposite, really. You know, as a bank that, you know, 1 in 3 farms that we bank, you know, if anything, it's the opposite. It's true that I'm being asked to by my senior exec how we can actually grow the sector more, where we can grow the sector more, what kind of new ponds do we need to fish in, how can we help and support our customers maximise their profitability. So I know there's long-term uncertainty with the transition payment reductions, but if anything, we're trying to work with our customers on a bottom-up approach, examine, you know, as Andrew and Neil have said there, you know, where can we diversify the income from, how can we become more efficient, how can we reduce the costs, and if anything, we're discussing individual working together joint plans to try and come together, and you know, we've got still a long-term lending aspiration, we've got a long-term relationship plan in place, and if anything, you know, we know there's going to be bumps in the road in terms of the outlook is a bit uncertain, but we're certainly, if anything, not tightening up our policy. If anything, we're trying to relax it in terms of help and support in the transitional period. We know there's going to be bumps in the road, but very, you know, it's a very resilient and resourceful sector. And as I said before, you know, we think the future of the farming in the sector is very good. We're one of the 2 or 3 growth sectors within the bank that are putting a lot of time and effort into it in this year and the years ahead. And really, you know, we're looking to see what mega trends, what future fit, you know, is that farm fit for the future? What's coming over the horizon to make your farm even better, and how can we work with you individually to, you know, iron out any of those wrinkles, Phil? So, you know, a lot of uncertainty, but if anything, the opposite's the what I'm seeing in terms of, you know, how can we help and support customers even more than we've done in the past, really.
I'm conscious that the kind of renewable energy is part of your job title, that areas around sustainability, renewables, climate change is something that you pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, how important is that? And there's a question in from Liz Sellers as well that's asked, you know, farmers big and small, they're asset holders when it comes to carbon sequestration. So to what extent is that going to feature in terms of the future of ag?
Yeah, well, funny you should say that. We on Friday we did a national we've got 125 full-time managers, so we've done a national kick-off carbon sequestration call to try and educate and improve their confidence and ability in the overall topic. We've only just scratched the surface, but when you talk about sustainability, climate change, renewable energy, they for me are I think Andrew mentioned, you know, there's massive opportunities. We hear about the challenges and the hurdles we need to jump over, but for climate change, sustainability, massive opportunity. I'm spending probably about 80% of my working week at the moment on the climate change, sustainability, renewable energy kind of topic. And we just kicked off a piece of work again where we're working with each farm to establish their kind of sustainability plan, where they are on the journey, what kind of help and support do they need. And we're working on some different products and propositions that incentivize, particularly in the farming sector, farmers to take advantage of, let's say, a slurry pit cover, for example. We would be able to offer finance and incentivize cheaper margin because it's got that sustainability tag on it. So again, we're exploring all avenues of the greenhouse gas emissions. We're piloting a particular tool that will help farmers benchmark again where they are. And the big thing for me is that we've done a bit of internal work with some economics. As a sector, we know where we're starting from a lending versus CO2 emissions point. We know where we need to get to be aligned to the Paris Agreement. And the next stage is to work individually with each customer to help and support their transition to that low carbon economy. And that means, you know, base camp 1, let's educate the managers that we've got in the bank. And that's all banks, not just NatWest, RBS, Phil. It's, you know, we've got to equip the managers to have decent, good quality conversations with customers and work with the individual experts out there to try and bring together, you know, a big plan that brings everybody on the journey. So again, I see renewables, the climate change, sustainability agenda topics, propositions as an exciting opportunity to help and support customers. We're doing a lot of work to try and get over the fact that you know, a lot of the farmers will be asking what's in it for me. You know, if I'm spending, you know, £1 million, for example, on a proposition that might not see payback, but we are looking to incentivize that particular product so it's a lot cheaper margin than the bog standard cowshed, for example.
And I guess it'd be, you know, it would be nice if that of government policy and some of the focus that is coming starts to dovetail with the commercial side. I just want to, Neil, I want to jump back to a point that you made, and this is George Mason putting you on the spot. So, if you could suggest one single area where a farm or farmers or growers can improve efficiency and therefore profitability, where should it be? What's your starting point?
I'm sorry to say, because everybody loves their big shiny things on arable farms, but I would always start at the machinery line, unfortunately. Machinery and depreciation, I think, for me, it was always one area that I would look at pretty quickly. Could it be the farm's overcapitalised? Is it invested in too much machinery? Those sorts of things. So, George, that would be my starting point. It's not the be all and end all, and it's not the beginning and the end, but it would certainly be one of the areas that I look at quite quickly. And usually where I've seen a business maybe in a bit of not as profitable as it could be, or a bit of financial distress, it does tend to be one of the areas that I would go to first. I'd be interested in Ian's point of view as well from a banking side, just on that.
I've got my views, Neil. I would say cost of production of a particular, whatever commodity, whatever you're growing or producing, cost of production for us is a key point, because we do a lot of work on the customer's debt service capabilities, and we do look at the ability to service the debt now, 10 times more than we used to in the past by just relying on the security. So, we've come to a stage now where a customer may have, adequate security, if not more than needed, but we would still really help and support and try and examine their cash flow to make sure they can actually service their debt to be a responsible lender. So I would look very hard at the operating costs and the cost of production of the unit or the commodity that you're producing or growing.
And Andrew, where does your focus go on your business?
Where I can make changes and the effects of the changes, not just the actual change. You can cut back on one particular area because it's, as I mentioned, the beans before, because it's not profitable, and have a negative effect on another. One thing we've done in the last couple of years is reduce our potatoes. That was partly because we're on the back of 2 very poor years. There wasn't as much capital in the pot to grow the things. I looked long and hard at it and thought, how can I improve this? And I cut out some ex-field contracts that weren't particularly profitable. That meant that in the early part of the season, we could get full days lifting in. We weren't dictated by bulkers or factory bookings or anything like that. That meant that we were lifting much less when the weather turned bad towards the end, as it often does, towards the end of October. We were finished much earlier, to the point where, have I forgotten a field? It made such a difference when you consider that in November, you can be muddling 4 or 5 acres a day out in the same amount of time, with the same men, the same machines as you were lifting 15 acres at the beginning of October. But you were messing about doing 7 or 8 acres because factory bookings were holding you back. By cutting out that contract, yes, there was an effect on cash flow, but we managed to get around that and increase the profitability of the enterprise per se by actually reducing it in size. There's a little bit of a notion that big is better, and it isn't necessarily always the case.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It's not necessarily about pursuing those kind of economies of scale, isn't it, and always pushing out. Quick question on rents that you've probably all got a view on, but there's a perception that BPS has in the past pushed up rents. Do you expect to see rents drop?
Interesting.
Sorry, I'll have a go at this first, Phil. We've talked. I think over the years we've talked lots about rents should be dropping here or there. And almost through all sorts of economic ups and downs, they've kept going, or they've stayed similar or moved up, because the demand for production has been there. And I think some of that maybe goes back a bit to what Andrew mentioned there. There's maybe this view that, well, actually big is better. If I take on more acres, I'm going to spread my costs about a bit more. All you need is 2 or 3 people thinking the same and going for it, and we hold rents up. If that continues, because people are looking at trying to get productivity gains to make up for a reduction in BPS, then actually, although it sounds a bit bizarre, you might not see rents move back, even though we think they're linked to BPS, because actually there might be other drivers come into the marketplace.
Yeah, Andrew, Ian, your view is on the rent side. I'm guessing as a tenant, you'd like to see your rent drop.
Always. If any bill that can come down is a good thing. But joking about the landlord-tenant thing, it's an important working relationship, and it needs to be beneficial to both parties, and that sometimes gets forgotten. A tenant that's not profitable isn't attractive to a landlord, because if he's not making any money, there's going to come a point when he can't pay his rent, and that's not good for anybody, because he isn't necessarily going to be looking after the holding to the best of his ability. Equally, if a landlord is too heavy with his pen when he's wanting his rent, it doesn't allow much left for investing in that holding. And ultimately, particularly as far as sheds and concrete and things like that go, that is going to benefit the landlord in the longer term. And a prosperous tenant is attractive to a landlord. So there's got to be a middle ground where it's beneficial to both parties. And that's down to discussion and negotiation.
Very quickly, Phil, I'm conscious of time. I go back to what Neil mentioned. I think with the CO2 kind of emissions on farm picture being, well, it becomes clearer and clearer as we go through the years, that will lead to more efficiency and hopefully in time more profitability. So I can't immediately see the correlation between BPS reduction and rent reduction. It all depend on more or less what Neil was saying in terms of, I think farms will become more efficient because they're looking more at their kind of emissions and their overall sustainability journey. So if anything, I think it'll just, if not, just plateau along.
Okay. So it's more about the big business side of things, looking at the whole business rather than kind of individual aspects.
Yeah.
I'm really conscious of time. Just kind of interesting, kind of one final thing from each of you is to kind of, it was that question of that Stephen raised that was talking through the relative uncertainty that there is. I mean, how long can we go without kind of getting clarity? When, ideally we'd all want something today, but being pragmatic, when do we need to know?
I'll take that one first. I think the next 2 or 3 months is going to be quite interesting because we're starting to build up a picture on customers' future plans, Phil, in terms of their, you've lost 10%, 20% of your single farm payment. What are you going to do to replace the lost income streams or reduce your costs? And I think once we get through probably into the June, July time, I would want to be towards the end of this year, certainly looking at what's coming back the other side, because I know that we've been guaranteed the same level of funding, but again, don't get me wrong, there's no pressure from the banks, no pressure from my senior stakeholders. We're in it for the long term. We're still lending over a 25, 30-year period, so not being asked any questions, but I would want to see something more concrete coming back towards the end of this year to try and build upon each individual customer plans.
And Neil, what helps you kind of make some of the business planning decisions and help your clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a view, and I don't think Stephen said it, but it was in something I read recently where it talked about this sustainable farming incentive. I think much more detail been available by sort of June time.
Yeah.
Frankly, if we need to wait much longer than that, and it's starting to, it's going to start to hurt businesses because, even a little bit of a knock in BPS. So, there's June. If we don't hear about sustainable farming incentive by June, BPS is starting to roll in towards the end of the year. It's going to be less. Where and how do farmers make decisions to try and bridge some of that loss of income? So really, back end of the summer, we need a lot. I'm not saying we need it absolutely down to fine detail, but we need a lot more information on direction of travel, Phil.
And Andrew, from your perspective,
without knowing where the goalposts are, we don't know where to point the ball, do we? It's if June becomes December, the frustration will really kick in. But I think that we have to be careful that we don't let Elm's policy and such things dictate our businesses. Short-term politics and long-term farming aren't necessarily great bedfellows at the end of the day. We've got to try and add value where we can, and I think the Elms and the stewardship and things like that is a way of adding value to what we do, but it doesn't want to be dictating our core business. If something is going to be good for the business, it probably needs to happen anyway. If we can wangle things a little bit so that it can be assisted by timing, particularly with some kind of farm investment fund money, I don't think that's going to be quite as lucrative as maybe we first thought. My gut feeling on that. It's assistance to build infrastructure, which I think is what builds resilience.
Yeah, and arguably then some of that takes us away from just farming policy into kind of wider government incentives and what we do around capital allowances, I guess. Look, guys, thank you for your time. Really conscious that our hour's up. Thanks again to Stephen, who joined us earlier on. Thanks to Thanks to the three chaps who've kind of given their perspective. Look, this is definitely not the last time that we'll be talking farm policy. We know more information is going to emerge. Quick plug that we'll pick it up as AHDB in our market intelligence. So if you're not one of the 44,000 people that are subscribed to our regular MI publications, get in touch and we'll sign you up for those. We'll also revisit in future webinars and briefings. So thanks to everybody who's joined us today. As I said at the start, there'll be a video recording of this available within 24 hours or so, and the slides will be put on the website. As ever, we appreciate your feedback in the survey questions that will appear on your screen as soon as this finishes. I also want to give a quick plug for a webinar that we're doing tomorrow. So same topic, but we're coming at it from more of a livestock focus. So if you're also interested in the livestock sector, have livestock, look forward to seeing you or being able to join us tomorrow. Thanks again for everybody for joining us, and thanks again to our panel. Much appreciated. Bye-bye.
Thank you.